Alright guys, we are going to be attempting to do pattern number 12. Now this one, when you kind of check it out, you can probably see some of the basic primitive shapes we're going to have to create. When I look at this thing, I'm seeing a black and white horizontal bar. There's going to be some type of triangular shape to cut away at part of the white bar. And then around everything we have kind of like a somewhat thick kind of white border. That whole shape tiles and repeats. And the repeating effect is at a 45-degree angle, so it's all kind of slanted. Now, even though it may not seem too difficult, there are going to be a couple little speed bumps we run into as we build the project. Now, what I'm going to do is do Command-N. We're going to do a new project. We're going to call this Pattern12, empty template, 2048 by 2048. Now, once we're inside of here, let's start off by making a shape node. Now with the shape node, I'm going to bring in this so it kind of makes a white bar. So I'm going to take the X scale and bring this down to exactly 0.5. Now it's centered and I can't move it here. So after the shape node, we're going to do a transform. And then with the transform, we're just going to figure out how I need to move this around. So this needs to go to the side over here, which apparently is going to be negative 0.25. Now, once I kind of have this in the right position, okay, pretty happy with that. The next thing we want to do is figure out how do I get the little triangular cutout effect. So this isn't going to be too bad. Our way to do this is we're going to use a Polygon Node. And this guy is really cool because you can kind of choose how many sides you want. If I go down to a 3-side, okay, you can tell there's my triangle. Let's see what happens if we blend this into the shape. So we're going to have this be the foreground. Okay, it's overlapping it because it's a copy, but as soon as I do subtract, you can see where that triangular shape is now eating into the white. Perfect. Now, what we need to do is then move this over, use a transform on it, so I can then rotate it until I get the right result. So I'm kind of double clicking on the blend so I can see it, because this is what I want to look at, but then I'm going to single click in the transform, and we're going to rotate it until it's pointing down. Let's move it up. I'm holding shift and just moving it upward is a repeating issue. We're going to fix that. But let's do a negative 0.5 here. Okay, that feels about right. Now it needs to go to the corner. If you look at the reference again, see how this black thing kind of goes out to the corner of the square? We're not quite there. So the next thing I want to do is zoom in a little bit. We're going to do Shift Command, click on that side scale bounding box, scale it out until right about like that. That looks pretty good. Now the issue we're running into is you'll notice again back here that this is scaling off the frame and repeating. To fix this, if you click on the transform node, up here where it says tiling U or tiling H and V, change it to absolute. We're going to say no tiling. So that will cause us to not repeat, because it's going to do that by default on any node. Typically you do want that, but that tends to be one of the more common things we're constantly changing in Designer, because there are going to be a lot of cases where you don't want it to repeat. You're just trying to make these little cutter shapes to eat away at something. So I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, we got that down. Now the next thing is we need to make that white border around it. Now to show you a couple little issues we're going to run into here. If I use a tile generator, watch what happens if I connect this into it. So we're going into the pattern input. We're going to say use the image input, because that's this guy. Okay. And let's not worry too much about the repeat for right now. Let's just sort of zoom in here, because the tile generator does have the ability to scale these down. So if I scale it, that should create a border, right? Well, let's kind of go down here and look for that scale option. Okay, there's the border, but it's a black border going around it. Remember, we wanted white. So the way to fix this thing is I'm bringing it down a little bit. What happens if I were to invert the result from the generator? Now you can tell we're closer. It's not perfect, but it's almost there. So by inverting it, it took what used to be this kind of like default black background from the generator. It's now flipped it so the border part is white. Now what's messed up? Well, the part that's messed up isn't the white border, it's the pattern inside of it. That's what's now messed up. Because we had it set properly earlier, we didn't want to flip the pattern itself. Now to compensate for this, we're going to do another invert on the pattern. So basically, because we're inverting this after the generator to fix the border, that messed up the pattern. So by inverting the pattern earlier, when it hits the second invert, it'll kind of flip back to the way it should have been. Hopefully that makes sense. But we're doing another invert here, invert grayscale. So the pattern going into the generator is backwards, but by the time it gets out of the generator and is flipped, you can see we finally end up with the right result again. That's not confusing at all. But I think you kind of get the idea of what we're doing. You'll pick up on little tricks like this the more you use Designer. If that didn't make sense, not a big deal. Again, it's probably your first day even using the software. This will just come, the more you practice with it. So the next thing we need to do is figure out how to rotate this guy. Now the rotation is kind of interesting because if I go to the generator and if you just kind of start scrolling through the settings, you eventually will see rotation. Like there's a rotation here. Well, that's not what I want. I need 45 degrees. I can't even pick that. Okay, let's keep going down. Aha! 45 degrees. This is exactly what we need. What happened? Looks cool, that's not what we want. Okay, well just look at what's happening to the pattern. It's spinning each tile individually, not the whole shape. So you're going to get these really weird overlapping issues where they're not giving you exactly what you want. So we have to approach this a little differently. And I'll show you the way to kind of figure this out. Anytime you need to rotate something with the generator, you don't want it to necessarily spin the tile because these still need to form a straight line. So maybe this means after the generator, we have to rotate the entire shape. So let's try that out. So after the invert, what happens if we drop a transform 2D and on this node we say 45 degrees? Well, that looks better, right? It's perfect. But hit space and look what happens when it repeats. Look at that nasty seam forming. You'll notice that the Transform 2D is doing a terrible job at tiling this thing. It is not repeating perfectly and we're getting awful looking seams. That is not going to be acceptable. So let's back up. How do we do this? This is a super common issue. And I'll show you basically how we fix it. The way to approach something like this, if you have a strange kind of 45-degree pattern, is to look for one single smaller shape that can be repeated that doesn't interact with the border. So what I'm kind of looking at right here is instead of worrying about the whole thing done at once, look at this 4x4 grid right here. Okay, 4 down, 4 across. I'm just going to do this little section. So let's take the tile generator and we're going to say 4x4. Okay, so there's that piece that's now repeating. And the trick is to use the safe transform grayscale. This node right here I use quite a bit. It's basically the same idea as a transform, but it specializes in weird 45-degree rotations. It'll almost like auto scale it with the rotation so it tiles perfectly. So it does all the hard math for you and you don't have to do much thinking. It's great. So watch this. If we just use a safe transform and on this guy we say turn 45 degrees, look at that. It's perfect. So if you kind of look at the shape, see how it's a 4x4? When you rotate it, it's turning it in the middle and scaling it down perfectly so that way it does tile. So the scale, we could have got it to work with the Transform 2D, but the scale is kind of the reason why it was breaking. I'd have to manually scale that around a little bit until it worked. But this is just the easier way to do it. You don't have to put much thought into it. Just use this, 45 degrees, it's perfect. The only thing wrong with it is actually the rotation of that white piece. Look at mine. See how it's kind of pointing the wrong way? That's going to be easy to fix. I can just drop a transform before we do that. We just need to rotate that 90 degrees until it looks right. So transform 2D, let's just hit that 90 degrees until it looks like that. There we go. So I think we've got it. Let's just double check that again. That looks perfect. Yep, we got it. So a couple interesting tricks we picked up on this one with that safe transform 2D. But again, you can tell overall that was not too difficult.